Hey guys, what's up? Evan from Stock Music Musician here today, and I want to show you how to master a song using iZotope Ozone. In this video, I'm going to use Ozone 9 to master sort of a classic rock track I've got. You'll learn basically my workflow, how I combine AI power features of Ozone with a lot of just ear, and just a lot of other great tips about how to use Ozone for mastering. If you're really interested in learning more about mastering though, and the whys and the hows of it, I've got a great free workshop that you can watch. There's a link down below. It's about an hour and a half long, and it teaches everything I know about the philosophy behind mastering. You know, my songs have been placed on TV shows, in a documentary on Netflix. They've been on NPR, streamed hundreds of thousands of times, and these are real practical tips you can use to take your home studio recordings and make them sound professional. So click on that link, watch that mastering workshop, and now let's cue the intro. All right, before we go any further, I also wanted to let you know that although I'm using Ozone 9 Advanced in this, you can probably use any version of Ozone software or even any combination of standalone plugins to master. This is just kind of showing you, I think, the best way to use Ozone 9 Advanced or Standard for mastering. If you don't have Ozone 9 yet, though, I do want to let you know that this plugin is probably the number one plugin that I recommend for people building out their home studios, because the features in Ozone 9 are just way more advanced than what you find in any DAW. DAW is like a stock plugin. And the thing about a mastering suite is that you're going to use this on every single song, whereas some plugins will only be a little bit here and a little bit there, but having a great piece of software really will maximize everything. Ozone 9 is often on sale for 50% off. I've got a link down below if you want to check it out and see if you're able to maybe catch one of those sales. All right, now let's actually learn how to use Ozone 9. Okay, so the first thing you're going to note is I've just dropped the raw exported audio file that I've mixed into my DAW, and I've disabled audio time stretch, and I've set my DAW to be at the same tempo that the song was originally. This is going to just make it easier to set some loop points here and here so that when I put the song on loop so I can listen to it and monitor it, I don't go crazy because it's not synced up, right? If the song keeps chopping out, you're gonna lose your head. So what I've done now is set the loop point to the loudest part of the track. This way, everything I do will still work well for the rest of the song. So we're going to learn how to master using Ozone. This will apply by and large to almost any version of Ozone, but I think I'm using Ozone 9 Advanced here. You don't need to get the Advanced. I think the Standard is still really good. The basic is that Ozone Elements will get the job done, but really Ozone Standard, whether or not you have the most recent version or not, is what I'd recommend. It's a great plugin. And so let's jump in. I'm going to add Ozone to the master channel here, not to the specific channel that my track is on, although I could do that, but I add it to the master channel in case there's some weird processing that I missed along the way. So we're going to go over here, Audio Units, iZotope, Ozone 9. Boom. We're done, right? No, we haven't even started. Mastering is not some magical thing where you just put on a plugin and it works. And it's not a thing where you want to use a preset. Never use a preset because every track is going to be different. It can be helpful to look through some of these presets just to kind of see how pros might approach it, but every song is so different, and the changes that you make in mastering, because they apply to your entire every sound, it's too extreme to rely on presets. And I'm also not going to rely completely on AI or even that much on AI, but we will use it a little bit just to help get the sound as good as possible. So let's take a quick listen to this song, and then I'll walk you very quickly through Ozone, and then we'll start mastering. Kind of a Led Zeppelin style classic rock track. And there's that loop working for us, because if that wasn't right, I would personally go nuts at least. So here's the basic interface of Ozone. If you go along here, you can add various modules from compression to maximizing, equalizing. You can turn them on and off, load presets for those individual sections, which I think actually can be somewhat useful at times. Remove them, solo them, select them, reorganize them, all of that fun stuff. Then down here, you actually have the interface for each unit, each element that you are applying, each piece of processing. Here you have overall presets and the ability to use the mastering assistant, which can be really helpful when used with a lot of knowledge about what you're using it for. Don't rely on the AI to do everything, but there are a few things that it can be really helpful for. Finally, over on the right, we have a bunch of metering tools, which are really helpful. With RMS is the average volume, and we're looking to have that over 14. Anything over 14 will be good from a commercial perspective. And then here you have the peak, which is how loud the loudest bit is. And we need that to be under 0, definitely. But I like to shoot for under -1, because basically what happens is when you convert a song, for example, from a WAV to an MP3, or if you upload it to like SoundCloud and they use whatever algorithm it is that to convert it into a streaming file, sometimes like digital artifacts are introduced, and those could be a little too loud. And if your levels ever go above 0, it'll give this really awful clipping sound that basically will make people not want to listen to your track. We've all heard like the and that's not what you want to have happen. So by leaving some space, basically, you're not going to be the loudest track out there, but you'll be plenty loud and you won't be distorted. So that's the basics of it. Let's now jump in. And the way I like to jump in is by using the Mastering Assistant to get started with 2 very specific things, which we'll talk about, but I'm going to show you how to use the Mastering Assistant first. So basically, all you do is hit Master Assistant. You choose whether you want it to be a modern sound or a vintage sound. Even though this is a classic rock style track, I'm still going to go with modern, and then I might add some vintage processing in. Well, we're not even going to go through. We're not going to use most of this automatic stuff, but we're going to use it for one thing. So we're going to stay with modern. If you wanted, you could load in a real professional track and compare it, and Ozone would do like some really cool behind the scenes stuff to help your song sound a little more like that. Although I often find this is just, it's too much processing and you lose your song, which is again why we're only going to use this AI very sparingly and only for a couple of key tasks. And then you can choose if you want it to be on streaming or CD, and it'll approach it a little bit differently. So let's hit next. And now we're going to play the loudest part of the track. It's going to get loud. Okay, so we're going to look through what it did real quick, and then I'm going to tell you what we're cutting out and how we're actually going to approach mastering with Ozone. So the first thing I did was I like to run it through the main reason I like to run it through the Mastering Assistant is because it finds out where your EQ, where your frequencies aren't maybe as much as they should be compared to a commercial recording, or too much frequency buildup of harsh frequencies. And yes, there's a lot to be said for training your ear for this. I do train my ear for this. As you can see, there aren't really a lot of changes that it suggested making. A big high boost, and I don't like high stuff, and then maybe a little bit on the low end. And basically the reason I do this is because, first of all, when I master my own tracks that I've recorded, that I've mixed, that I've produced, and maybe I'm just, either because I've got hearing loss, or because there's weird echoes in my room, or maybe because my speakers don't have a lot of low end, whatever it is, you can only trust your ears so far if you've done everything in your own room. So this kind of gives you a second set of ears on it by trusting the AI assistant. But I don't use it for more than that. So everything else is to taste. You'll notice basically recommends a slight low boost and a slight high boost. I'm going to turn both of these off. Maybe we'll do some more high end later, but we're not going to do it with this EQ. Mainly what I was looking for is if there was any harsh frequencies that I needed to cut out. Next, you have a compression section. We'll start building our chain in a second. But you notice it doesn't even think that we necessarily needed any dynamics compression on everything. Finally, you have a dynamic EQ, which is, again, you'll notice it's cutting out, well, the way this works is basically it cuts out these little frequencies here when they get too loud or too harsh. And so, well, I'll hit play and you can see how it works. And so what that's doing, like I was talking about, is harsh resonances or things where it's like, you know, when the kick and the bass hit together, maybe something weird happens. It's controlling the high end a little bit, some of that harshness that I said I didn't like. And this is sort of what enabled it probably to boost the high end without making it sound too much harsher, because it's cleverly turning it down when it's at its brightest. So let's listen to this with it on and off real quick. And with it on, it definitely is making like the bass and the kick a lot clearer, a lot cleaner. And so we are definitely going to have this on permanently. And there's just, it's not really efficient for you to use your time either to go find those frequencies and set that up. Finally, we've got the maximizer. And we'll come back to this at the very end and set this once we've done all the other processing. But it's nice to have it on early just so that you can hear everything clearly because it'll be loud enough. So now that we've got the basics of the AI getting us started, now we're going to start adding our own modules. So the first thing I would normally do is add a subtractive EQ to remove any bad frequencies. But we already have done that, and there's nothing to remove really. So the next thing I'm going to do is add what they call a glue compressor. So a glue compressor basically just kind of is going to be intended to add a little bit more bounce to the track. We're not really trying to take away the peaks too much, but we're basically trying to make a needle move in time to the way your head would move and subtly just put a little more rhythm in the track. But this is going to be really subtle when it's ultimately in there. But for now, we're going to dial in an extreme setting so we can get the attack and release right. So we'll set the ratio to 4. That'll just make it easier to dial it in. We do not want makeup gain on because we're going to make up the gain in another way. And so let's hit play, and we're going to dial on the threshold first to get about 6 to 8 dB to begin with. So now what we want to do is there's various modules here. But if, as you're learning to develop your ear, basically, what would your head be doing? We'll be doing bump, bump, bump. So we want to adjust the attack and release until this knob is kind of doing that same thing, or this graph. So what you can see is this is like all squiggly. That means the release is way too fast. So let's... And the attack is probably too fast as well. So let's see. 60 seconds and 60 seconds. We'll see where this gets us. This is probably too slow, but that attack is actually probably pretty close. It's going when we want it to go. And let's do some more of the release. You're feeling kind of wanting to do like that. So now let's adjust the threshold to actually make this a more reasonable, like 1 dB to 2 dB of gain reduction. I'll lower the ratio just a little bit. You can set the threshold or the ratio. It's basically just dialing in how much we want to reduce it. So let's try this on and off. me, it has a little more rhythm to it, a little more groove. It is slightly quieter because we're lowering it at times, but we'll make up for that volume down the road. We just don't need to make up for it right now. The next thing I like to do is add add a little bit of vintage EQ. And this is going to if you'll recall earlier when we had the AI EQ, what that was doing was boosting the high end. And we will do a high end boost here, but these vintage style EQs are just a little warmer, a little more musical. So we're going to add a little bit of a boost on the high end. So we go to high boost, and I think we'll start at like 10K. And that seems to, bring the cymbals out a little more. Now let's listen and see if there's any other parts we just don't really feel cutting through enough. I kind of feel like where the snare is, which is probably 500 or 700, could probably just come up a little bit, just so the snare pops a little more in the context of the guitars. Or we could try and cut a little bit where the guitars are, but let's see what a small boost of like 500 does. That sounds good. That brings out the snare a little bit, and maybe some of the a little bit more of the drums, like the kick, and a little bit of the bass without doing too much to the guitars. Let's try this. That's sounding really good. I'm going to turn on another feature of Ozone, which is gain match. If you notice, we've turned some things up, we've turned some things down, but if we want to hear whether or not it's sounding better or not, Ozone is smart enough to automatically adjust the levels if you turn things on or off, so we can really just hear what we're doing other than making it loud. So let's try turning everything off and seeing if we've improved it yet. I think we have. I think it is cleaner on the low end thanks to dynamic EQ. It grooves a little more thanks to the vintage compressor. And there's just a little more space thanks to the high, or the vintage EQ. And let's see about a little higher boost here. That sounds better to me. The 10K was a little harsh, but 12K is like kind of moved it past the main part of the cymbals, which we're just trying to create a full sound tonally, but also make the most important elements stick through. But you notice I'm not radically changing this at all. Your track should be well mixed before you start down the road of mastering. The next thing I want to do, and this is, going to depend on your genre, but generally, I like to consider an exciter, because this is like a classic rock thing. Basically, what I want to do is model almost this going through like a console and just getting some tube warm-up. And here, the presets can be really helpful for this. So I'm just going to try a light tube. See, it's very gentle, but it's per band, so it's a little precise. That makes it a little more aggressive. It's kind of adding like a little bit of overdrive to the track. And especially I'm hearing it like on the kick, on the snare, and then also on the high end. Everything just gets a little bit of nice edge from this. If you're doing mastering and you have the processing power, definitely turn on oversampling, because it just processes the in-between bits better. Next, because again, this is a vintage style track, I am going to put on a vintage tape emulation, and this should sort of fatten things up and add a little bit more glue. And so typically, you can start with a, preset here. I usually just go with 15 speed and then adjust the input drive and these emphases until it starts to sound good. To think about is, so we're actually going to take the volume down because tape prefers to have a lower RMS, basically a lower average volume hitting it before it starts to saturate and sizzle. So we'll probably take the volume down here because I wasn't doing a lot of gain staging going in. And basically I just want to turn it down until it doesn't sound crunchy, but I still hear some warmth coming in. You hear how when it's all the way up, it sounds blown out. So I feel like this now, because like the tape is rolling off some of the highs, I want to put some more in. The low end is sounding fatter though, so let's try this on and off and see. I'm not sure that this is helping a lot. I might go for a slightly more subtle tone. And I feel like the tone is better, but we're losing some of the dynamics, like some of the groove, some of the punch. So I'm going to try turning the input down a little bit and we'll just see. And part of the reason is probably we're hitting the maximizer a little bit. So the reason I'm turning this down, like the thing I'm listening to for when I'm talking about these dynamics is like, do I feel like I'm getting smacked in the face by the kick and the snare? And when this goes higher, when the input is higher on the tape, instead of like a smack on the face from the kick and the snare, it's more like a soft caress because it's clipping those, or not clipping, but it's cutting off those transients. And so dialing this down until we have a clear sound, but we still get some of the, or clear dynamics, but we still have some of the warmth and the tone shaping from the tape. And I've turned down the maximizer too far. And so we've lost a little gain from this input drive. Again, not a big deal. We'll make it up down the road. But to me, overall, the vintage tape is just adding a little more. And it doesn't really matter the individual modules you use. It's more about what I'm trying to go for, right? Like a vintage track, this is how it would have been processed. And there's also tape modulation on the exciter if you wanted to do that instead. Finally, I'm going to use the vintage limiter to, this is going to do like take down some of the peaks, and then we'll do the maximizer to take a little more of the peaks, and often stacking compression or stacking EQ. Stacking most things tends to be better than going for extreme settings on either one. So we're not going to leave a ceiling on this one because we'll rely on the regular maximizer to do the ceiling. We'll experiment with the different modes, but I'd like to get like maybe a half dB of limiting on this. And basically limiting is just compression, but more extreme. By limiting out the peaks, you can turn up the volume of the overall track. But you don't want to make it sound like cut off or undynamic. And we need to turn off the final maximizer so that we do not hear it working. I want you to listen to the way the kick sounds on this, especially on analog mode. Well, let's listen to this first. I think, if you listen between tube and analog, you'll hear a big difference in what's kind of like saturating on the low end. The tube is sounding kind of loose and flabby, whereas the analog is just sounding way more focused as a setting. For this track, every track's going to be different, though. I'm not saying always rely on this. And the modern just wasn't doing it for me. Then the character basically decides how fast or slowly the attack and release times work on this mastering compressor or limiter. But to be honest, I almost always leave it at 2. It seems to be a really reliable setting for not having obvious pumping, which is what we're seeking to avoid. We're just trying to shave a few of the peaks off so we can get louder, and then thankfully the saturation from analog mode is just making things sound better. Finally, we'll turn on to the last maximizer, and here you've got a bunch of different modes, but usually I like IRC4, modern, transient, and classic. We'll try each one, but first we'll try and set the ceiling. Well, we'll set the character first to 2. Stereo independence, no, we want these 2 stereo channels to be linked so that whatever happens on the left side affects the right side. The transient emphasis goes and places spikes, transients back on it, and we don't want that at the end, probably. But we'll see if we do. And we don't need true peak on. True peak basically prevents you from clipping on really fast things, but if your ceiling is set to 1, you're probably not going to have a problem with true peak. So let's adjust the threshold. Let's link the stereo channels. Sorry, we don't want to link those 2. So let's. So you'll notice because we used the vintage limiter previously, we've already gotten a lot of gain, and so we don't need as much from these. This is just going to be doing a very little work. Again, maybe a dB of limiting. And again, modern isn't really working for this. Transient might be better. It just lets out through more. All right, so I do like what transient emphasis is doing there. It's creating a little bit more peakiness. And that is really the basics of mastering an ozone. You figure out what you're trying to accomplish each step of the way, and you try and get it to a nice volume with a good peak. Streaming services are probably going to turn that down, but it's okay. We've got a good peak. We've got a loud volume. It's not over compressed. It sounds like a nice track. This would work well. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope you've learned a lot about how to master with Ozone. And I wish you luck.